Is it that all of Christianity is ridiculous childhood fairy tales? Or is it that the version of things that you were presented was for a 10-year-old kid?
And I think a lot of those young men who, have turned out for Jordan Peterson lectures over the last several years, probably some of them had some kind of vague church, background. But all they remember is a kind of Sunday school version of Christianity.
Justin Brierley is the author of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. We'll be reading this book in the Wisdom Society Book Club in the month of October, and then joined by Justin for a time of Q&A at the end of the month. Click the link in the description to join the Wisdom Society.
Do you feel that these people that you're documenting are sort of, for the time being, in that phase of believing, the Christian story is useful? We're not necessarily saying it's literally true, but we need religion. Even if it is a psychological trick, it's better than atheism. Are we in that sort of like Lewis a couple years before he actually converted phase? Or are some people actually going all the way to?
I think it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed picture. So a lot of the people I'm chronicling in the podcast, and indeed in the book as well, are people who are in different places on that spectrum. Some, I think, probably are still in the it's a useful fiction kind of form. So someone who's definitely there, I would say, or at least from what I know of what he said recently, is Brett Weinstein, for instance, who's an evolutionary biologist, but who takes a very different approach to religion to, say, Richard Dawkins, who says religion is bad for you, it's a delusion, it's a kind of evolutionary misfiring, effectively. And Brett Weinstein says, no, it's there for a reason, because it's been really helpful. So he sees it as a useful fiction. He says it's literally false, but metaphorically true, is the way he likes to talk about religion. So that's a very kind of, he's very clearly, camping out on the kind of useful fiction. I would say similarly, Jonathan Haidt, to some extent, again, someone who absolutely recognizes the value of religious traditions, speaks very warmly about, lots of the biblical aspects that give meaning and wisdom. But again, I think he says it's a useful fiction. It's not actually true, but it's really useful. And maybe, applauds, and encourages people, if they feel inclined to be religious, to do so, because it's, but then I think you've got some people who are kind of more teetering on the edge of not just acknowledging that there's a useful aspect psychologically, socially, culturally to Christianity, but who are thinking, well, it's only really helpful if it's true, actually. And it's no good in the end, just sort of being slightly snobbish and saying, well, it's helpful if people believe this, but we're a little bit above that. And we've realized, that it's not really true. And I would say you've got people in that camp who maybe might include Tom Holland, for instance, where he really understands that he wants the idea of human rights to be true, but he knows it's a theological invention. So if it's true, there has to be a God, and there has to be something about this Christian story that kind of basically grounds it that is true. And I think he's one of those people on a journey to kind of possibly edging towards accepting that there's something that actually grounds this in reality. I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali is clearly maybe a little bit further along in that journey. She's decided, actually, I acknowledge the usefulness of this, but I've got to leap into it for this to actually work, basically. And then there's plenty of people who have made the full sort of leap, if you like. So I talk in the book, and you may have heard on some recent episodes of the podcast, conversations with people like Paul Kingsnorth, who's a fascinating example of a celebrated author and poet here in the UK, highly intelligent person who has had this extraordinary adult conversion, in the last few years to Eastern Orthodoxy. And really, he would say he bounced around in a lot of different places, but ultimately found that the story that made sense of everything in a totalizing kind of way was ultimately Christianity. And he had not expected it to be, but when he jumped in, he found this was the thing that made sense of it all. So I think there's people all on different parts of this spectrum. And I'm just really interested in telling all of their stories, because I think they're all signs that something's changing in our culture, because none of it, whether you see that it kind of on the useful fiction side of the kind of the Brett Weinstein or the Paul Kingsnorth who's jumped in, this, I title this A Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which is very different to the sort of new atheist heyday where people like that would have been laughed off the stage at, some 20 years ago.
I think it's interesting, sort of just thinking about the basic plot points of this, where new atheism actually sprung up in the broader context of basically postmodernism and relativism, and then it was very modernistic in a lot of ways. It wasn't, that works for you, but it was like, no, we feel a very certain way about this, and we're going to make a case against it. But now it seems that, like you kind of said, that has sort of aged out or phased out for a lot of people. It's been tried and found wanting for a lot of people. And now it seems like you're kind of, tell me if this is right, but that the idea that there's utility in belief in God is at least a gateway for maybe a certain percentage of people back. And now we're sort of in this middle ground space where, okay, so there's a utility to it, but is it really real? Is it just useful? And it's interesting.
I think you're right. And I think it is people like Tom Holland, for instance, are having a huge effect in this area, where they're just, as secular historian in Tom's case, saying, look, if you actually go and do some history, you'll quickly discover that all of the things you most value in terms of Western liberal democracy, human rights, equality, progress, freedom, they didn't come from science. They didn't come from atheism. They didn't come from the Enlightenment. All of those things are actually downstream of this Christian revolution. That's actually the thing that gave you. Now, that doesn't mean it's true, but it's waking a lot of people up to the fact that they're kind of reliant on the Christian story at some level. And that alone, I think, is enough to sort of shake people out of their kind of assumptions that, we all just live in this, common sense secular era, to realize actually, no, that these beliefs that I hold aren't necessarily the only game in town. It could have turned out a different way. There are other parts of the world with significantly increasing interests, Putin's Russia, China, where they might have a very different idea of what life is about. So I think it's you shouldn't underestimate, even the people who aren't saying it's true, but who are just pointing people back towards the values that they got from Christianity. It can have an important effect. Likewise, Jordan Peterson, very difficult to pin down exactly where he stands on the God question. But he's definitely opened a doorway for people to take it more seriously. And I know plenty of people who have stepped through that and have now baptized believing Christians because Jordan Peterson kind of gave them intellectual permission to take it seriously again. Often, yes, initially in a kind of practical way, said your life might be better off if you went and read the Bible again or thought about praying, even if it was only kind of suggested as a sort of purely psychologically helpful, thing. I think enough people find, though, that in the process, they can actually take the story seriously. And so I just think that there is a trajectory that goes on, if you like, from socially useful to people actually taking it seriously enough to potentially believe in it.
Another thing I think is fascinating, the kind of the expose that you're doing and the impact that I'm sure will have on people who were actually raised in Christian homes, attended Christian schools or Catholic schools, but then, and this I can think of for myself, dozens of friends who this is their story. Then they went on to college and they were, biology majors at UF or whatever, and they were basically presented the atheistic materialistic worldview from a college-educated perspective, and it completely shattered their seemingly shallow foundation. And so it's this interesting thing where you get Christianity at a grade school level and you get atheism at a college level, and so it feels like that's the more intellectual or adult worldview to have. But what you're showing here is actually something that I think will be very useful for those sort of deconstructed Christians as well, who are probably, who I know personally, some are struggling with that meaning crisis. And to be able to show, I think, that story as well, that, let's just pause for a second and consider, is it that all of Christianity is ridiculous childhood fairy tales, or is it that the version of things that you were presented was for a 10-year-old kid, but there's actually a lot more depth there to be gleaned. Now go back and do it as an adult. And I think that's where a lot of people are at as well.
Yeah. And I think a lot of those young men who, have turned out for Jordan Peterson lectures over the last several years, probably some of them had some kind of vague church, background. But all they remember is a kind of Sunday school version of Christianity. And suddenly this person from outside the church starts to talk in very serious terms about the depth of these Bible stories. And suddenly their minds get blown and they're like, oh, I had never even realized that it could be taken seriously. And I think that is the great danger, is exactly as you say. We don't, especially with young people, potentially actually expose them to a kind of the depth of Christianity, so that when they do end up going, as you say, to secondary education, higher education, suddenly it appears childish. But I think that's down to the church. It's very often failed in that sense to do that kind of catechesis that does just help young people to engage a deeper level of faith, so that they don't suddenly think that it's all childish and so on. I also think that deconstruction itself is where I see it being driven the most is in certain forms of evangelical Christianity in America, where I think it's a certain form of Christianity that people are rejecting rather than Christianity, Orthodox Christianity itself. And I sometimes just think people need more exposure to a wider breadth of Christian tradition and thought, frankly, and that you would head a lot of that stuff off at the pass if you had just given, people a chance to experience something beyond their own very narrow, culturally conditioned version of Christianity, which has not been the experience of the vast majority of people for the last 2,000 years, or indeed most people around the world. So I do fear that the deconstruction is from a very specific type of fundamentalist evangelical Christianity that people inevitably end up growing up in parts of the USA.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's a classic case of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and I think that the bathwater, a lot of it does need to get thrown out, and I think that we need to present things in a more deep, mature way, like you said, from the onset, because people are going to have questions as people grow up. They're going to have questions that have answers, but those answers need to be presented. I think, in my opinion, sort of on the front end, like let's get out in front of all of the attacks or whatever you want to call it that you're going to face in college. And let's just go ahead and have the whole worldview conversation now while you're 16, rather than trying to safeguard anybody from.
Yeah. Yeah. Worst thing, I think, in an internet age, the worst thing that a Christian parent can do is try to, or a church can do, is try to kind of put a young person in a bubble where they don't get exposed to other points of view, to objections and everything. It's an absolute disaster, because you can only keep that bubble from popping for so long, and once it does, well, what's going to happen. So I absolutely agree with you, and that's why when we're around the dinner table with our kids, I want to have the conversations now. I want to hear what they're hearing. I want to even put the objections to them myself. I don't want to just sort of make out this is all will kind of make sense at at every level. I want to kind of introduce the complexity and mysteriousness, and just and there are going to be some things where I'm going to be honest and say I don't think I have the full answer to that, but that's okay, because that's an adult response. We don't have everything sewn up in the end. But what I can say is this worldview is a more compelling view than any other I've encountered. It makes more sense at multiple levels. Doesn't mean there's no questions that need that go unanswered, but for me, have those conversations early rather than sort of allow them to lose their faith once they leave the house and enter the adult world.